There is a man lying in the dark tonight who cannot see. He has not been able to see for 4 years. He is old and he is poor, though he was not always poor. And he lies on a mat with his face turned toward a ceiling he cannot make out, listening to his wife move around a house that used to be full and is now very quiet. He has done nothing wrong. That is the part that will not let him rest. He has spent his whole life doing exactly what he was supposed to do, burying the dead when no one else would touch them, giving away what little he had to people who had less, and this is where it delivered him. A mat on a floor, a ceiling he cannot see, a son he is afraid he will die without providing for. And 3 days' journey away, in another country, there is a young woman lying in a different dark. She is beautiful, and she is wealthy, and she has been married 7 times, and 7 times the man she married did not survive the wedding night. She lies awake now, not grieving one husband, but 7, and carrying something worse than grief. The quiet suspicion that she herself is the reason, that something moves in the room with her that no lock can keep out, and that no man who comes near her will ever be safe again. Neither of them knows the other exists. Neither of them knows that heaven has already begun moving toward them both. Neither of them knows that a young man is about to be sent on a journey with a stranger who is not what he appears to be, walking the whole road beside him, eating at his table, laughing at his jokes, saving his life more than once, and never once telling him his real name until the very end. Tonight, we follow that journey. It is one of the strangest and gentlest stories to survive from the ancient world, a story small enough to fit inside one family, and large enough to hold everything you have ever wondered about, whether your prayers are actually being heard, whether the ordinary detours of your life are as random as they feel, and whether someone might be walking beside you right now without your knowing it. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. We are going to Nineveh first, into a dark room, to a blind man who does not yet know that tonight, of all nights, his prayer is finally about to be answered. Chapter 1. The Man Who Buried the Dead. Picture the city of Nineveh, not the Nineveh of ash and ruin that later prophets would describe, but Nineveh in the years after the northern tribes of Israel were carried away from their homeland and scattered into Assyrian territory. Thousands of exiles living inside a foreign empire, keeping their own customs quietly, trying to raise children who would remember who they were in a country that had no interest in remembering it for them. Among those exiles was a man named Tobit, the old book, and I want to be careful with that phrase tonight because we will lean on it often, gives us his own voice for the opening of this story. He speaks in the first person, the way a man might speak into a private journal, recounting the shape of his own life before the trouble came. He tells us he was from the tribe of Naphtali, that his family had kept the old ways, even when everyone around them abandoned them, that he alone among his relatives used to travel to Jerusalem for the feasts, while his own tribe worshipped the golden calves that Jeroboam had set up in the north. He's telling us gently and without much boasting that he was a man who kept faith when keeping faith was inconvenient. That matters for what comes later, because everything that happens to Tobit will eventually ask the same question that every hard season asks of every person who has tried to live rightly. Does faithfulness actually protect you from suffering, or does it simply mean something different than protection? In Nineveh, Tobit did well for a while. He served in the household of the Assyrian king, and he had money, and he used it the way he had always used what he had, quietly, without display. He tells us he used to walk the roads and markets of the city looking for the poor among his own people, the ones who had nothing, and he would bring them food. And there was one particular kindness he practiced that set him apart from almost everyone around him, a kindness that in the ancient world was neither small nor safe. When one of his people died, especially if the death happened at the hands of the Assyrian king's own violence, and the body was thrown outside the city wall to rot as a warning to others, Tobit would go out at night and recover the body and give it a proper burial. This was not a minor act of piety. The old book tells us plainly that this practice put Tobit's life in danger more than once. There was a period when the king, Sennacherib, was slaughtering many of the Israelites in a rage after a military failure and leaving their bodies exposed outside the city as an act of humiliation, denying them even the dignity of burial. Tobit kept going out anyway. He kept bringing them in under cover of darkness and burying them according to the law, and eventually someone informed on him, and he had to flee the city and leave everything behind, his goods confiscated, his life reduced overnight to nothing. He tells us that he lived as a hunted man until the king died and his household changed, and only then was he able to quietly return. I want you to sit with this man for a moment before the trouble that defines the rest of the story begins, because it is important to know what kind of person we are talking about. He was not reckless. He was not performing virtue for an audience. He went out at night to bury strangers because the law required the dead to be treated with dignity, and almost no one else was willing to pay the price of obeying that law under a hostile government. This was who Tobit was before anything happened to him. A man who paid the cost of doing the right thing, quietly and consistently, year after year, when there was no one watching and no reward in sight. And then, on a particular festival day, the Feast of Weeks, Tobit did what he always did. He had a fine meal prepared, and he sent his son Tobias out into the streets to find someone poor and bring them back to share it. Because Tobit's custom on the feast days was never to eat alone, while others in his community went hungry. Tobias came back and reported something urgent. One of their own people had been murdered and was lying strangled in the marketplace. Tobit rose immediately from the table, left the meal untouched, and went to bring the body in before sundown so that it could be buried properly. He hid the man in a room of his own house and waited for nightfall, because burying the dead was again forbidden under the current ruler, and once night came he went out and buried him. Then he came back into his own courtyard, and because he had spent the day handling a body and was ritually unclean, he lay down along the courtyard wall to sleep outside rather than bring that uncleanness into the house. And this is where the old book records the detail that changes everything. As Tobit slept that night with his face uncovered against the wall, sparrows roosting above him let their droppings fall into his open eyes, and white films began to form over them, and no physician could cure it. Over time, the old book says, Tobit went completely blind. Now I want to pause here and honor what this detail actually is before we move forward, because I think it is easy to read past it too quickly. This is not a punishment. The old book does not present it that way, and nothing in the story that follows treats it as the consequence of sin. It is simply what happened. A man doing the right thing, exhausted from doing the right thing at real cost to himself, lay down to rest, and something entirely unrelated to his goodness happened to his body while he slept. Birds roosting where birds roost. An old injury, ordinary and undramatic in its origin, becoming permanent through nothing anyone could have prevented. This is worth sitting with tonight if you are carrying something that makes no sense to you. Not every hardship is a message. Not every wound has a moral behind it. Sometimes a good man buries the dead all day and then loses his sight to something as small and as arbitrary as a bird overhead while he slept in his own courtyard. And there is no lesson in the birds. There is only what happened and what happens next. Tobit spent the years after this, the old book tells us, dependent on his wife Anna, who took up weaving work to support the household because Tobit could no longer see well enough to do his old work. And here, the story does something remarkable, something most ancient literature does not bother doing. It shows us the wear on the marriage. Anna would take cloth she had woven to her employers, and they would pay her. And sometimes they would add a bit extra, a young goat perhaps, as a kindness or a bonus for good work. One evening she came home with such a goat, and Tobit, sitting in his blindness and hearing the bleating, immediately assumed she had stolen it, and told her sharply to give it back. because he could not bear the thought of eating something that was not rightfully theirs. Anna's response is one of the most human moments in the entire ancient world's religious literature. She turned on him. She said, "So where are your acts of charity now? Where are your righteous deeds? Everyone can see what has become of you." She was not being cruel for its own sake. She was exhausted. She had watched her husband give away everything they had to strangers his whole life, had watched him nearly executed for burying corpses no one else would touch, had watched him go blind doing another act of that same relentless goodness, and was now working with her own hands to keep them both fed. And the first thing he did upon hearing she had been given a small gift was to accuse her of theft. The old book does not soften this moment or explain it away. It simply records it and lets it sit there. The frustration of two people who have loved each other faithfully and are now grinding against the edges of a hardship that has worn both of them thin. If you are lying awake tonight in a season that has worn thin the patience between you and someone you love, you are not the first faithful household to feel this particular kind of exhaustion. It is in the old book. It was true then. It survived being written down because it was recognized as true. And Tobit, stung by his wife's rebuke and grieving all at once, the accumulated grief of years of blindness and poverty and the loss of everything he had once been able to do, went and lay down and prayed to die. He prayed that God would take his life, because life had become, in his own words, nothing but grief and reproach. He asked to be released from a suffering he could no longer make sense of. That is where we leave Tobit for now. An old man lying in the dark, having just prayed for the release of death, in a house where the marriage has grown brittle with hardship, waiting for an answer he does not expect will come. Let his prayer settle into the quiet of your own room for a moment before we travel to the second household, because heaven, the old book is about to tell us, was already answering him, though not in the way he asked. Chapter 2. The Woman with 7 Graves. 3 days' journey east in the city of Ecbatana, there was a young woman named Sarah, the daughter of a man named Raguel. She was, the old book tells us, beautiful and sensible, from a good and wealthy family, and she should by every ordinary measure have had an easy path through the world. She did not. Sarah had been given in marriage 7 times. And 7 times on the wedding night itself, before the marriage could even be completed, her husband had died. The old book does not soften the horror of this for her. It tells us plainly that a demon named Asmodeus, described as the worst of demons, had taken a possessive hatred toward her and killed each husband before he could touch her. 7 times this happened. 7 funerals instead of 7 marriages. 7 young men who came to her father's house with hope and left it, or rather were carried out of it, in mourning clothes. You do not need me to explain to you what 7 repetitions of this would do to a young woman's sense of herself. The old book tells us that Sarah's own household servants, in the ugly way that grief and fear sometimes curdle into cruelty among people who are themselves frightened and helpless, had begun to taunt her, suggesting that she herself had murdered her husbands, that she was cursed, that there was something wrong with her that made her a danger to any man who came near. One of the maids, in a moment of open contempt, said to her that she hoped never to see a son or daughter of Sarah's, since she had already killed 7 husbands. Sarah went up to the upper room of her father's house after hearing this, and the old book tells us she wept, and then she considered hanging herself. And then, in the same breath, she stopped because she thought of her father. She thought about what it would do to him, an old man, to bury his only child by her own hand, to carry that grief on top of everything else their household had already carried. She could not do that to him. So instead of ending her life, she went to the window and she prayed. I want you to hold this moment carefully, because it is one of the most quietly courageous scenes in the whole story, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. Sarah did not pray a polished prayer. She prayed the prayer of someone at the absolute edge of what a person can bear, torn between wanting to be finished with life and refusing to add more grief to a father she loved. She asked God plainly why she should go on living, and then in the same prayer she asked that if it was not God's will to take her life, that he would at least look upon her with mercy, that he would not let her hear this reproach anymore. She was not demanding to understand the demon, or the 7 deaths, or the injustice of what had happened to her. She was simply asking to be seen and to be released from a suffering that made no more sense to her than Tobit's blindness made sense to him. And here the old book does something that I think is the real engine of this entire story, something worth sitting with quietly before we go any further. It tells us that at that very moment, in that very hour, the prayers of both of them, Tobit in Nineveh and Sarah in Ecbatana, were heard in the presence of the glory of God, and the angel Raphael was sent to heal them both. Tobit to remove the white films from his eyes so he could see the light of heaven with his own eyes, and Sarah to be given in marriage to Tobias, Tobit's son, and to be freed from the wicked demon Asmodeus, because it was ordained that Tobias should have her before any other suitor. Read that again slowly, because it is easy to move past too quickly at this hour of the night. 2 people in 2 different cities, unknown to each other, praying 2 different prayers out of 2 different kinds of despair on what the old book tells us was the very same day, and their prayers arrived in the same place at the same time, and were answered by the same single act of heaven, before either of them knew the other existed. Tobit did not know Sarah's name. Sarah did not know Tobit had a son. Neither of them could have imagined how their suffering was already being woven together into the same answer. This is worth carrying into your own night tonight. If you have ever wondered whether your prayer, spoken quietly and alone into what feels like an empty room, actually reaches anywhere, or whether it simply dissolves the moment it leaves you. The old book's answer, offered here not as argument but as story, is that the prayer arrives, and that it is sometimes being answered through a person you have not met yet, in a place you have never been, in a way you could not currently imagine, even if someone tried to describe it to you. Sarah's healing was already in motion the moment Tobit's blindness happened to intersect with the timing of heaven, though from where either of them stood, nothing had visibly changed yet at all. Let both of their prayers rest together for a moment in the dark. An old man asking to die because he can no longer make sense of his suffering. A young woman asking to be spared further reproach because she cannot make sense of hers. Neither prayer answered the way it was asked. Both of them about to be answered in a way neither could have designed for themselves. Rest in that irony a little tonight, if your own prayers have felt unanswered in the shape you asked for them. The story is only beginning, and the angel is already walking. Chapter 3. A father's memory and a son's errand. Back in Nineveh, Tobit, after his prayer for death, remembered something. It is a small, practical detail, the kind of thing that seems almost mundane against the backdrop of prayers rising to heaven and angels being dispatched. And that mundane quality is exactly why I want to slow down on it, because so much of this story works that way, the sacred moving quietly through the ordinary business of a family trying to survive. Tobit remembered that years before, he had left a sum of money, 10 talents of silver, in the safekeeping of a relative named Gabael, who lived in the distant city of Rajas in Media. It had been sitting there for years, untouched, while Tobit and his family had grown poor in Nineveh. And now, believing his death was near, Tobit called for his son Tobias and began to instruct him the way a father instructs a son when he believes he is speaking some of his final words. The instructions the old book gives us are worth pausing on, because they form a kind of compressed wisdom literature inside the larger story. An old man's accumulated understanding of how to live, handed to his son in what he believes are his last days. He tells Tobias to honor his mother all her life and never grieve her. He tells him to remember the Lord all his days and never willingly sin against his commandments. He tells him to give alms from whatever he possesses and never to turn his face away from anyone who is poor, so that God's face will not be turned away from him. He tells him, in a phrase that has echoed through the centuries and appears in various forms across many traditions, to do to no one what he himself would hate. He tells him not to drink to excess or let drunkenness be his companion on the road. He tells him to hire a trustworthy companion for wages if he goes on a journey, and to always pay a worker his wages the same day, and never withhold them. And then he tells him about the money left with Gabael, and instructs him to go and retrieve it so that the family might have something to live on. Tobias, being a good and obedient son, agreed to go, but pointed out the obvious problem. He had never met Gabael. He did not know the road to Rajas. He had no idea how he would even recognize the man he was supposed to collect the debt from. Tobit told him not to worry, that he would find a trustworthy man to go with him as a guide, someone who could be paid for his trouble, and Tobias went out to find such a man. And here, in the plainest and least dramatic language imaginable, the angel enters the story. Tobias went out and found a man standing there, though he did not know that the man was the angel Raphael. He asked him if he knew the way to Media, and the man said he did, that he had traveled that road often and stayed with their relative Gabael. Tobias brought him back to meet his father, and Tobit, still blind, questioned the stranger, asking about his family and his tribe, and the angel, giving the name Azarias and claiming descent from a respectable Israelite line, answered convincingly enough that Tobit, satisfied, hired him on the spot to accompany his son. I want you to notice something about how heaven operates in this story, because it is different from almost every other angelic appearance you may have heard described in Scripture. And it is, I think, the central quiet claim the whole book is making about how God moves through ordinary life. Raphael does not descend in fire. He does not appear in a vision. He does not announce himself with any of the trembling grandeur that surrounds Gabriel at the Annunciation, or the guide in the ascension of Isaiah moving Isaiah up through 7 heavens, or the burning ones that undid the prophet Isaiah in the temple. He simply stands where a young man happens to be looking for a travel companion and answers the questions put to him and takes the job. This is, I think, one of the most quietly radical claims in all of ancient religious literature, that heaven's help does not always arrive with announcement, that sometimes the answer to a desperate prayer looks from the outside exactly like an ordinary stranger willing to walk beside you on a hard road, someone whose credentials you check the way you would check anyone's, who eats at your table and does not glow, who you hire for wages the way you would hire anyone. Azarias did not tell them who he was. He let them believe he was a man like any other man, because that was the form the help needed to take in order to do what it had come to do. If you are lying in the dark tonight wondering whether help is coming, I want you to hold this detail carefully. The old book is not promising you a vision. It is not promising fire in the sky or a voice from heaven. What it is quietly suggesting, in the plainest terms it has, is that the help may already be standing in the room where you are looking, wearing an entirely ordinary face, waiting only to be asked the question that lets the journey begin. Before they set out, Anna, Tobias's mother, wept bitterly at the thought of her son leaving on such a long journey, worried aloud that the money was not worth the risk of losing her only child. Tobit reassured her that a good angel would go with him and that his journey would be successful and he would return safely. He said this, the old book makes clear, without knowing how literally true his own comfort was. He meant it as the kind of reassurance any father offers a frightened mother. He had no idea he was speaking the plain truth. And so Tobias set out from his parents' house with the dog that had, almost as an afterthought in the old book's telling, simply come along with them, and with Azarias walking beside him, and neither Tobias nor his mother nor his father had any idea what was actually walking down that road with him or what waited at the far end of it, or what price had already been paid in prayer 3 days away by a young woman he had never met. Let this settle before we travel further. Sometimes the companion who changes everything about your life enters through the most unremarkable door imaginable, hired for an ordinary errand, walking beside you because you happen to need a guide and someone happened to be standing there. You do not always recognize the angel by their glory. Sometimes you only recognize them much later by what they carried you through. Chapter 4. The River and the Fish. The road to Media ran alongside the Tigris River, and on the first evening of the journey, Tobias went down to the water to wash his feet, and a large fish leapt up out of the river as if to swallow him. Tobias cried out in fear, and the angel, still known to him only as Azarias, told him to seize the fish and hold on to it. Tobias grabbed the fish and hauled it up onto the bank. And then Azarias gave him a set of instructions that must have seemed at the time strange enough to make a young man wonder exactly what kind of guide he had hired. "Cut open the fish," he said, "and keep the heart, the liver, and the gall, and set them aside carefully and throw away the rest of the entrails." Tobias did as he was told, and they cooked and salted the remaining flesh of the fish for the journey, and the old book tells us they continued on together. Tobias, understandably curious, asked what possible use the heart, liver, and gall of a fish could have. And Azarias explained, in the same plain, practical tone he used for everything, that the heart and liver, if burned, produce a smoke that drives away any demon or evil spirit so that it never troubles a person again, and that the gall, applied to a person's eyes that have white films over them, blown into the eyes, will cure the blindness. I want you to notice the shape of what has just happened, because it is easy to miss on a first pass. The angel has, in the most understated way imaginable, just handed Tobias, without explanation of why it matters, the exact cure for both of the specific afflictions we have spent the last 2 chapters sitting with in the dark. Tobit's blindness. Sarah's demon. Neither has been mentioned to Tobias yet. He does not know his father is going blind from anything more than old films that no physician could treat. He certainly does not know that a demon has already killed 7 husbands in a city he has never heard of. And yet the ordinary fish that startled him at the river's edge has just produced, entirely without his understanding of why, precisely what will be needed. This is, I think, one of the gentlest and most beautiful claims the whole book makes. And it is worth carrying with you tonight if you have ever looked back on some ordinary and even frightening moment in your own life, a startle at a riverbank, a chance encounter, a detour you did not choose, and wondered much later why it happened exactly when it did. The provision for tomorrow's crisis is sometimes placed into your hands today, disguised as something ordinary, something you would not think twice about, long before you understand what it is for. You do not need to understand the fish to keep the liver. You only need to trust the one walking beside you who tells you it will matter. As they continued on the road together, Tobias, still not knowing who he was traveling with, asked Azarias a natural question since they were approaching the region where Raguel lived. He asked what medicine the liver and heart and gall might be good for in more detail, and Azarias, with the same patience he had shown throughout, told him something else, something that reframes the entire rest of the journey. He told Tobias that they would be staying that very night in the house of a relative named Raguel, who had a daughter named Sarah, and that Tobias, as her nearest kinsman, had by law the first right to marry her. And then, gently, Azarias told him the truth about her 7 husbands and the demon that had killed each one on his wedding night, and told him not to be afraid, that if he burned the fish's heart and liver in the marriage chamber, the demon would smell the smoke and flee and never trouble Sarah again. Tobias's response here is one of the most honest and least heroic moments in the entire story, and I love it for exactly that reason. He did not respond with brave confidence. He told Azarias plainly that he had heard about Sarah, that he had heard she had already had 7 husbands who all died in the bridal chamber, and that he was, in his own words, the only son of his parents, and he was afraid that if he went into her, he would die like the others and bring his father and mother down to their graves in grief over him, since they had no other child to bury them. This is not the language of a confident hero walking fearlessly toward his destiny. This is a frightened young man, an only child, terrified of dying and of what his death would do to 2 parents who had already suffered enough, being asked to walk directly into a room where 7 men before him had already died. If you are carrying fear about something ahead of you tonight, something you know you are supposed to walk toward and cannot make yourself feel brave about, sit with Tobias here for a moment. He was not brave. He was honest about his fear, and he kept walking anyway because the one walking beside him told him it would be all right. And something in him, despite the fear, chose to trust that. Azarias answered him with the plainest kind of reassurance, reminding him of the remedy they now carried, and telling him that when he entered the bridal chamber, he should first pray, and only afterward should the marriage be completed, and that God, who is merciful, would show them mercy and save them. He told him not to be afraid, that Sarah had been set apart for him before the world began, that he would save her, and that they would have children together, and that all would be well. Let that promise settle into the dark of your own room for a moment before we move on. The strange comfort of it, the specificity of it, offered not with a vague reassurance that things would probably work out, but with the flat certainty of someone who actually knew, because he had, in fact, already carried both of their prayers into the presence of God, and knew precisely how they had already been answered. Tobias did not know that yet. He only knew that the man beside him spoke with a steadiness that made the fear a little easier to carry the rest of the way to Raguel's door. Chapter 5. The Wedding Chamber and the Burning Heart. They arrived at the house of Raguel and were welcomed warmly, the old book tells us, as the kinship between the families was quickly established and celebrated. Raguel, seeing Tobias, wept and blessed him, recognizing in his face a resemblance to his own dear kinsman Tobit, and Raguel's wife Edna wept as well, and Sarah herself wept when she was told who had come. The whole household, in other words, met this arriving stranger not with suspicion, but with an outpouring of grief and joy tangled together. The particular emotional weight of a family that has been carrying loss for a long time, suddenly finding a living relative standing in their doorway. Raguel prepared a feast, and in the middle of it Tobias, prompted by Azarias, asked Raguel directly for Sarah's hand in marriage, invoking his right as her nearest kinsman. And here the old book shows us something remarkable about Raguel's character. A father who has buried 7 sons-in-law and is now being asked by an 8th young man to marry his daughter. Raguel did not hide the danger from him. He told Tobias plainly what had happened to the 7 men before him, and told him that out of love for him, since he was a relative, he did not want to see him die as well, and urged him, if he wished, to simply eat and drink and enjoy the evening, and let the Lord deal with the matter as he saw fit, sparing Tobias the choice if the young man wanted it spared. But Tobias refused to be talked out of it. He told Raguel he would not eat or drink anything until the matter was settled, and Raguel, seeing his resolve, relented, called for Sarah, took her by the hand, and gave her to Tobias as his wife, invoking the law of Moses over them, and asking God's mercy and peace to be upon them both. Then, and this detail is worth noticing, Raguel wrote out a marriage contract and sealed it, the ordinary legal business of a family joining another family, conducted with full seriousness even in the middle of what everyone in that house understood might be, by nightfall, another funeral. That night, the old book tells us, they led Tobias into the bridal chamber, and Tobias, remembering exactly what Azarias had told him, took the fish's heart and liver from the bag he carried, and laid them on the burning coals of incense. And the smoke rose, and its odor, the old book says, drove the demon away to the remotest parts of Egypt, where the angel Raphael, no longer disguised in this account, went and bound him. I want you to notice what Tobias does next, because it is the actual center of this entire chapter, more than the fish, more than the fleeing demon. Before anything else happened in that room, Tobias got up from the bed and drew Sarah with him, and they began to pray. He said, and the old book gives us his actual words, "Blessed are you, O God of our ancestors, and blessed is your name forever. Let the heavens and all your creation bless you. You made Adam, and you made Eve, his wife, to be his helper and support. And from these two the human race has come. You said it is not good that the man should be alone. Let us make a helper for him like himself. I now am taking this kinswoman of mine, not because of lust, but with sincerity. Grant that she and I may find mercy and grow old together." And Sarah, the old book tells us, said with him, "Amen." Sit with this prayer for a moment, because it is one of the tenderest things preserved in all of ancient religious literature, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. Here is a young man on his wedding night, in a room where 7 men before him have died, who has just been given the exact remedy that will save his life, and his very first act before he does anything else is not relief, not haste, not even a private prayer of thanks that he has survived. It is a shared prayer with the woman he has just married, naming together the goodness of marriage itself as God created it, naming his intention plainly, that he has not come to her out of lust, but out of sincerity, out of the deliberate choice to build a life with her, and asking together that they might be allowed to grow old together. The plainest and most human of all the requests a person can make of God. Not glory, not wealth, just years. Just the ordinary gift of growing old beside someone. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, Raguel could not sleep. Convinced that this 8th husband would be dead by morning like all the ones before him, he went out in the dark and had a grave dug quietly, so that the burial could happen before daybreak without further scandal or delay. And he sent a servant girl to check quietly whether Tobias was alive. She went and looked and found them both sleeping soundly and safely, and ran back with the news. Raguel's response to this news is one of the most moving moments in the whole book, the sudden collapse of an old man's carefully managed grief into overwhelming relief. He blessed God, he wept, he ordered the grave filled back in before daylight, so that no one would know of his fear, and he prepared an enormous feast. And he made Tobias promise to stay for 14 days of wedding celebration, sending word ahead to Tobit and Anna in Nineveh not to worry, that all was well, that their son was safe and married. If you are lying awake tonight, having quietly prepared yourself for the worst outcome of something you cannot control, having dug the grave, so to speak, before the news has even come, hold Raguel in your mind for a moment. He was wrong to dig it. He filled it back in by morning, laughing through his own relief at how wrong his fear had been. Not every dread you are carrying tonight is a forecast. Some of it is simply fear doing what fear does in the dark, preparing for an ending that the morning has no intention of delivering. Chapter 6. The Waiting Parents. While the wedding feast stretched on for 14 days in Ecbatana, back in Nineveh, an old man and his wife waited, and their waiting deserves its own quiet space tonight, because it is one of the most tender and least remarked upon threads in the entire story. Tobit, remember, had originally sent his son for what he expected to be a short journey, retrieve the money from Gabael, and return. He had no idea that his son would be delayed by an entire wedding, by a demon that needed driving out, by 2 weeks of feasting in a city 3 days away. As the days stretched past what he had expected, Tobit began to worry, and Anna's grief, which had been simmering since the day Tobias left, began to boil over entirely. The old book gives us Anna in this stretch of the story with a rawness that is almost startling for how ancient the text is. Every day she went out and watched the road, the same road her son had walked away down, and every day she came back having seen nothing, and she wept, and she said to Tobit that their son was dead, that something terrible had befallen him on the road, that he had been delayed too long for any innocent reason. Tobit tried to comfort her, telling her their son was surely well, that some business had simply detained him, that the man traveling with him was trustworthy and would bring him home safely. But Anna would not be consoled. She said to him, "Be still. Stop trying to deceive me. My child has perished." And she went out daily to sit and watch the road by which her son had left, refusing to be comforted by anyone, wearing herself thin with a grief that had nowhere yet to land because nothing had actually happened. Only time had passed, and time, when someone you love is out of reach and overdue, can feel exactly like grief, even before there is anything to grieve. I want to stay with Anna for a moment tonight, because I suspect some of you listening are doing exactly what she did, watching a road, waiting for news that has not come yet, filling the silence with the worst possible explanation because the not knowing has become harder to carry than almost any bad news would be. The old book does not rush her through this. It lets her sit at the road's edge day after day, refusing comfort, and it does not tell us she was wrong to feel what she felt, only that what she feared was not, in this case, what was actually happening. Her son was at that very moment 3 days away, safely married, eating at a feast that would not end for 2 more weeks, entirely unaware of how many hours his mother had spent staring down an empty road because of how long his errand had stretched. If you are waiting on news tonight, if there is a road you keep returning to in your mind, someone overdue, some silence stretching longer than you expected it to, I want you to hold both truths that this chapter is offering you at once. Your fear is not foolish. Anna's fear was not foolish. Delay really can mean disaster, and the old book never suggests otherwise. But delay is also simply sometimes delay. Sometimes the person you are waiting for is only late because there was a wedding you did not know about, a feast you were not invited to, a demon being driven out 3 days away that will only ever be good news once the full story finally reaches you. You cannot know from where you are standing tonight which kind of waiting this is. But the old book, in choosing to include Anna's ordinary, unglamorous grief at the roadside at all, seems to be gently insisting that the waiting itself, however hard, is not proof of the worst outcome. It is only proof that you love someone enough for their absence to cost you something. Eventually, the old book tells us, when the 14 days of the wedding feast were complete, Tobias asked Raguel to let him go, worried that his own parents believed him dead. Raguel tried at first to persuade him to stay longer, but relented, sent him off with half of everything he owned, servants, flocks, silver, and blessed him and Sarah on the road, and Edna, Sarah's mother, blessed Tobias as well, and asked him gently to be good to her daughter all the days of his life. Azarias, still traveling with them, went on ahead as planned to collect the money from Gabael in Rajes, so that nothing would delay their return any further, and then rejoined them for the final leg of the journey home. And so the party set out at last toward Nineveh, toward the road Anna had been watching, unaware that today, of all the many days she had watched it and seen nothing, was finally going to be different. Chapter 7. The Goal and the Sight. As they approached Nineveh, Azarias, still walking beside Tobias in his ordinary human disguise, said something that shifted the whole shape of the homecoming ahead of them. He told Tobias that he knew his father would be waiting, that Anna would see them coming from a distance, and that when Tobias arrived, he should go ahead and, using the fish's gall they still carried, anoint his father's eyes. He explained in the same practical tone he had used throughout the whole journey exactly what would happen. The white films would shrink and peel off, and his father would see the light of day again and would rejoice at the sight of him. Meanwhile, the old book tells us, Anna was, as she had been every day, sitting watching the road, and this time she saw her son coming in the distance, and she ran to Tobit and said, "Look, your son is coming, and the man who travelled with him." And Tobit, blind and unable to see any of this for himself, rose and came stumbling out to meet them. And Tobias, seeing his father coming toward him, took the fish's gall and applied it to his father's eyes, as they had been instructed. And then, the old book tells us, waited, holding his father, and after about half an hour, the white films began to peel from the corners of Tobit's eyes, and Tobias peeled them away with his own hands. And Tobit, for the first time in 4 years, saw his son standing in front of him. The old book gives us Tobit's response in his own voice, and it is worth hearing in full. The plain, overwhelmed joy of a man who has just watched the world return to him after years of darkness. He said, "I see you, my son, the light of my eyes," and he wept. And he blessed God, and the whole household wept with him, and the entire community that heard the news came to celebrate with them, that Tobit, who had been blind, could now see. I want you to hold this moment carefully tonight, because of everything that had to happen for it to arrive. An old man had to be blinded by something as small and undramatic as bird droppings while sleeping outdoors after doing the right thing. He had to endure years of poverty and marital strain and the particular grief of dependency, of having to be led by the hand through his own house. He had to pray in despair for the release of death. And none of that despair was wasted or wrong, and none of it was undone retroactively by the healing that came after it. The years of darkness happened. They were real. Anna's exhaustion was real. The accusation over the goat was real. And still, on an ordinary afternoon, his son came walking up the road with a small vial of fish gall carried 3 days from a city Tobit had never seen, and the darkness ended. This is, I think, one of the most honest things the old book has to offer anyone lying awake tonight in a season of waiting that has already gone on longer than seems bearable. The healing, when it came, did not erase the years that came before it. It simply arrived finally, carried by an ordinary young man who did not fully understand, until much later, everything that had gone into making sure he arrived with exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. Chapter 8. Who the guide really was. With Tobit healed and Tobias safely home with his new wife, the family turned, finally, to the matter of paying the guide who had made the entire journey possible. Tobit called Tobias to him and told him that Azarias must be paid generously, beyond even the wage they had agreed, because of everything he had done, guiding him safely, healing Sarah, retrieving the money, and now this, the restoration of his own sight. Tobit suggested that half of everything they had brought back should go to Azarias as payment. Tobias went to Azarias and made the offer, and told him plainly that he considered his own life to be owed to him, and that he wanted him to accept far more than what had originally been agreed. And here, at last, the old book gives us the moment the whole story has been quietly building toward, the reveal that even careful readers, knowing it is coming, still find themselves slowing down for. And Azarias called Tobit and Tobias aside privately and told them to bless God and give thanks to him publicly for everything that had happened. Because it is good, he said, to conceal the secret of a king, but to reveal and give due honor to the works of God is a fine thing. He told them to make known God's deeds with due honor and not to be slow to acknowledge him. And then he told them plainly who he was. He said, "I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord." He told them that when Tobit had risen from his meal and left it untouched to go bury the dead, and when he had wept in his blindness, he, Raphael, had been sent to test him, and that God had sent him to heal both Tobit and Sarah. He told them that all those days he appeared to them, he had neither eaten nor drunk anything, that what they had seen was only an appearance, and that he was now about to return to the one who sent him. The old book tells us that both Tobit and Tobias fell to the ground in fear at this revelation, and Raphael told them not to be afraid, that peace would be with them, and to bless God forever. He said that he had, in fact, brought the record of their prayers into the presence of the glory of the Lord, that when Tobit had buried the dead, he had been present, and when he did not hesitate to rise and leave his dinner in order to bury the dead, he had been sent to put him to the test, and God had sent him at the same time to heal him and Sarah. He told them, "Now bless the Lord on earth and give thanks to God." And as he said these words, he ascended, and when they rose to their feet again, he could no longer be seen. I want you to stay in this moment for as long as you need to tonight, because it recasts everything that came before it. And it is worth letting that recasting settle slowly rather than rushing past it. Every mile of that road, every meal shared at the table, every moment Azarias answered a question, or gave an instruction, or reassured a frightened young man on his wedding night, all of it had been walked and spoken by someone who stood in the very presence of the glory of God, and who chose, for the entire length of that journey, to wear the ordinary face of a hired travel companion rather than reveal for one moment who he actually was. Think about what that means for the texture of the whole story. Tobias never once got to feel the awe of walking beside an angel. He felt instead the ordinary comfort of walking beside a capable, trustworthy older companion, someone who answered his questions plainly, who did not mock his fear on his wedding night, who simply told him what to do and let him do it. The comfort Tobias received on that road was never the comfort of the miraculous. It was the comfort of good company on a hard journey, and only afterward, only once the journey was fully finished and the healing fully complete, did he learn that the ordinary companionship itself had been the miracle the entire time. This is, I think, the deepest thing this whole story has to offer anyone lying in the dark tonight, quietly wondering whether they are walking through their own hard season alone. The old book is not telling you that if you look hard enough tonight, you will see wings, or feel a presence you can name, or hear a voice you can be certain is not your own thoughts. It is telling you something gentler, and in a way more useful for an ordinary Tuesday of an ordinary difficult life. It is telling you that help sometimes walks beside you for the entire length of the hardest road you will ever travel. Without announcement, without glow, without proof, asking nothing more of you than that you let it walk with you, and that only much later, sometimes only in looking back, do you finally understand what or who was actually there the whole time. Chapter 9. The Song of an Old Man Who Could Finally See. After Raphael ascended and could no longer be seen, Tobit, still on the ground where he had fallen in awe, composed a song of praise. And the old book preserves it for us in some detail, an old man's overflowing gratitude, finally able to see the world again, finally certain that everything he had endured had not gone unnoticed by the God he had continued to serve through all of it. He praised God as the one who scourges and then shows mercy, who leads down to the depths of the underworld and brings up again, and there is nothing that can escape his hand. He called on his fellow exiles to acknowledge God before the nations, because God had scattered them among the nations for their unfaithfulness, but had promised also to gather them again if they turned back to him with all their heart and soul, and to deal fairly with them and to show them mercy. There is a particular tenderness in the fact that Tobit's song of praise, once his sight was restored, was not primarily a song about himself, about his own healing or his own relief. It widened almost immediately into a song about his whole scattered people, about the larger story his own small story sat inside. He had spent years unable to see anything beyond the walls of his own dark room, dependent on his wife, wondering whether his life had come to nothing more than grief and reproach. And the moment his sight returned, the first thing he did with it was to lift his eyes toward the whole horizon of his people's suffering and hope. and sing about that too. If you are in a season tonight where your world has narrowed down to the size of your own particular pain, the size of the one dark room you cannot see beyond, I want you to hold this detail of Tobit's song gently. It does not ask you to widen your vision before you are ready. Tobit could not have sung this song while he was still blind and grieving and lying on his mat praying to die. The widening came after the healing, not instead of it. But it is worth knowing, as a kind of quiet promise for later, that healing, when it finally comes, often does not stop at simply restoring what was lost. It tends to open outward into a gratitude and a vision larger than the private grief that came before it. Tobit's song goes on to imagine, with striking specificity for a man who had spent years unable to see, a rebuilt and glorified Jerusalem. Gates of sapphire and emerald, streets paved with the precious stones of Ophir, all the houses crying out with praise. It is the vision of a man who, having just had his physical sight restored after years of darkness, immediately reaches for the largest possible vision his imagination can hold, as if the miracle done for his own two eyes had reopened some deeper capacity in him to hope for things far beyond his own household. Chapter 10. The last instructions and the long life after. The story does not end with the healing or the song. The old book gives Tobit and his family many more years together, and it is worth walking through the shape of those years before we close tonight, because they tell us something quiet and important about what this whole story believes a good ending actually looks like. Tobit lived to a great old age, the old book tells us, and before he died, he gathered Tobias to him one more time, the way he had done at the very beginning of the story, when he believed his death was near and sent his son on the journey that changed everything. This time, though, the instructions were different. Not urgent preparations for a father who feared he would not see his son again, but the calm, considered wisdom of a man who had lived a long, full life and had watched, with his own restored eyes, exactly how faithfully his prayers had been carried and answered. He told Tobias to take his family and leave Nineveh because he had come to believe. And here the old book gives Tobit a kind of prophetic clarity about the future of the city that had housed his family for so long, that the great city's downfall was coming, that everything the prophets had spoken against it would eventually come to pass, and that it would be safer in time to be elsewhere. He told him to honor his mother, to bury her beside him when her own time came, and to continue all his life in the practices Tobit had modeled for him from childhood, giving alms, keeping the commandments, treating people honestly, never turning his face from the poor. Tobit died at a peaceful old age, the old book tells us, and was given an honorable burial, and Tobias did exactly as his father had instructed, caring for his mother in her own old age until she died and was buried beside her husband. And then Tobias, with Sarah and their children, left Nineveh as his father had told him to, and went to live with Sarah's family in Ecbatana, and lived to hear, before he himself died at a great old age, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, the news of the very destruction of Nineveh that his father had foreseen. I want you to notice the particular shape of this ending, because it is different from the shape of endings in some of the more dramatic apocalyptic visions this channel has walked through before. The seven heavens, the wars in the storm country, the final judgment of nations. This story ends with none of that. It ends with an old man dying peacefully after a long life, having buried his parents with honor, having raised children of his own, having watched from a distance the fulfillment of a prophecy his father spoke to him decades earlier. It ends, in other words, with nothing more and nothing less than an ordinary good life, fully lived, fully finished, surrounded by family, at peace. This is worth sitting with tonight if the story of Tobit has felt so far almost too gentle compared to some of the grander visions you may have heard on other nights. No seven heavens, no war in the air, no throne room shaking with the voices of burning angels. Because I think that gentleness is the entire point of this particular book, and it may be exactly what some of you need to hear tonight, more than any vision of cosmic scale could offer you. The old book is telling you, in the plainest terms it has, that an angel of the highest order, one of the seven who stand before the glory of God, was once sent on assignment not to unveil the future of empires or the architecture of heaven, but simply to walk an ordinary road beside an ordinary frightened young man, retrieve an ordinary debt, deliver an ordinary young woman from an extraordinary grief, and restore the ordinary eyesight of an old man who only ever wanted to see his son's face again. Sometimes the old book is quietly insisting the whole of heaven's attention and effort is spent not on the fate of nations, but on one family's very small, very specific griefs. A debt owed, a demon that needs driving out, a set of white films that need to be peeled away from an old man's eyes. If what you are carrying into sleep tonight feels too small to matter, too domestic, too ordinary to be worth heaven's notice, a strained marriage, a worry about your children, an old debt, an illness that has no dramatic explanation, hold Tobit's story close. Nothing in it was cosmic. All of it mattered enough for an angel to be sent, to walk the whole road, to carry both prayers into the presence of the glory of God on the very same day, and to stay disguised the entire journey, so that the help itself never once outshined the ordinary company it was quietly providing. Chapter 11. What kind of book this is, and what it is not. Before we close tonight, I want to keep the promise I try to keep every night we spend together, the promise to tell you plainly and honestly what kind of book we have been reading, because you deserve that clarity as much as you deserve the story itself. The Book of Tobit does not appear in every Bible you might pick up. It is included in the Catholic and Orthodox canons of Scripture, where it has been read and treasured for many centuries as fully authoritative Scripture. But it is placed among what are usually called the deuterocanonical books, or, in Protestant tradition, the Apocrypha, and it does not appear in the Hebrew Bible or in most Protestant Bibles at all. This is worth knowing plainly rather than glossing over, because it means that depending on the tradition you were raised in, or the Bible sitting on your own shelf, tonight's story may be one you have never had access to before, or one you have heard read aloud in church your whole life. Both of those experiences are common, and both are worth respecting. Scholars debate its origins with real uncertainty. It was likely written sometime between the 4th and 2nd centuries before Christ, probably in the Eastern Mediterranean world, drawing on older folktale patterns, the Grateful Dead motif, the healing journey, that were widespread in the ancient Near East, and weaving them together with a deeply Israelite theology of exile, faithfulness, almsgiving, and the conviction that God hears the prayers of ordinary and remarkable households as attentively as he hears the prayers of kings and prophets. The oldest surviving fragments of the book were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, in both Hebrew and Aramaic, which tells us plainly that this story was being read and copied and valued by a Jewish community centuries before Christ, regardless of where later traditions eventually placed it on their shelves. I tell you this tonight, not to unsettle the story we have just spent this long night walking through together, but because that has always been the promise of these evenings, that I will never let you mistake the old book's voice for Scripture's own voice, or scholars' careful uncertainty for confident doctrine, or my own gentle picturing of a scene for anything the old book itself actually claims. Tonight, almost everything we have walked through together has been the old book's own voice, its own story told plainly, needing very little of my own imagination laid over it, because the story itself already carries so much tenderness in its own bones. What I can tell you with full confidence, resting on your own Bible's clearest ground, is that its most treasured lines have echoed forward for centuries because they touched something true. Do to no one what you yourself would hate is a close cousin to the words Jesus himself would later teach. Do to others as you would have them do to you. The old book's confidence that God hears the prayer of the poor and the prayer of the grieving with equal attentiveness sits comfortably beside the Psalms, beside the promise that the Lord is near to the broken-hearted. Its quiet insistence that generosity to the poor is never wasted, never forgotten, always remembered by God, sits beside Christ's own teaching that whatever you did for the least of these, you did for him. Whether every detail of the story happened exactly as told, whether Raphael truly walked that literal road in that literal disguise, is a question honest readers across many centuries and many traditions have answered differently, and I will not pretend to settle it for you tonight. What is not in question, and what I hope you carry with you into sleep, is the shape of the God this old story insists upon. Patient, unhurried, working through ordinary detours and ordinary strangers and ordinary fish caught at ordinary riverbanks, weaving together the prayers of a blind old man and a grieving young woman who never met, until the exact right moment arrived for both of their long nights to finally end. Chapter 12. The Blessing for Your Own Road. We have walked a long road together tonight, from a dark room in Nineveh where an old man lay praying for death, to an upper window in Ecbatana where a young woman stood at the edge of her own despair and chose, instead of ending her life, to ask one more time to be seen. We have walked beside a frightened young man and the companion who never once told him who he really was until the very end. We have watched a fish startle at a riverbank and become, without anyone fully understanding why at the time, the cure for two separate griefs that had not yet met each other. We have watched an old woman wear thin with worry at the edge of a road, and we have watched that same road, on an ordinary afternoon, finally bring her son home. If you are lying in the dark tonight, carrying something that makes no sense to you, a hardship with no clean explanation, the way Tobit's blindness had no clean explanation beyond a bird roosting where birds roost, I want you to remember that the old book never asked him to understand it before it healed him. It only asked him to keep doing, in his blindness, exactly what he had done in his sight, giving what he had, keeping faith, refusing to let his darkness make him unkind until the day arrived in its own unhurried time, when the healing finally came, walking up the road in the shape of his own son's returning footsteps. If you are carrying a grief that has made you afraid of what you might bring to the people who love you, the way Sarah feared what she might unknowingly bring to any man who came near her, I want you to remember that heaven did not wait for her to solve her own affliction before sending help. It sent Raphael before Tobias ever left home, before either of them had any idea what was coming. Your healing does not wait for you to have first understood your wound. It is sometimes already 3 days down the road, walking toward you, disguised as something ordinary, before you have even finished asking to be seen. And if you are simply weary tonight, the ordinary weariness of a long day inside a long season, the weariness of Anna at the roadside, of Tobit rebuilding a life from nothing more than what his hands could still manage in the dark, I want to leave you with the last plain thing this old book has to offer, the thing it says, quietest of all, but perhaps means most. Angels do not always arrive with wings visible. Sometimes they arrive as the ordinary companion who happens to be standing exactly where you go, looking for help, who eats at your table without complaint, who tells you plainly what to do next, who walks beside you the whole hard length of the road, asking nothing more than to be allowed to walk it with you, and who you will only fully recognize, if you ever fully recognize them at all, much later. Once the healing is complete and the fear has passed, and you finally have the stillness to look back and understand what was actually beside you the entire time, Let us pray quietly, the way the old book's own household prayed together on the hardest night of their journey. Father, we thank you tonight for the small, ordinary shape of this old story, for a blind man who kept giving what he had even in his darkness, for a grieving woman who chose, at the very edge of despair, to ask once more to be seen, rather than to end her own story in silence, for a frightened young man who walked forward anyway, and for a companion who carried both of their prayers to you and then walked the whole road home without ever once needing to be thanked for it by name until the very end. Thank you that you hear the prayer of the poor and the prayer of the powerful with the very same attention. Thank you that our own small griefs, a strained marriage, a worry we cannot solve, a body that will not heal, a debt we cannot pay, a fear we cannot explain even to ourselves, are never too small for you to send help toward. Give us tonight the patience of Tobit, who kept his integrity through years he could not make sense of. Give us the honesty of Sarah, who did not pretend her despair away, but brought it plainly before you and asked to be shown mercy. Give us the courage of Tobias, who was afraid and said so, and walked forward regardless, trusting a companion he had not yet fully come to know. And if there is a companion walking beside any of us tonight that we have not yet recognized, open our eyes gently, in your own good time, the way you opened Tobit's, not before we are ready, but exactly when we are. We ask this in confidence that you are even now, carrying whatever we have prayed tonight into your own presence, and that you have already begun sending exactly what each of us needs, 3 days down whatever road we are walking. Closer than we know. Amen. Sleep now, traveler. The road you cannot see the end of tonight has already been walked once, by an old book's own account, by someone who wore an ordinary face the whole way and never once let the ordinary company feel small. Whatever your version of the white film over the eyes is tonight, whatever your version of the demon at the door, whatever your version of the son who has been gone longer than expected, the story is not finished, and the help may already be closer than 3 days away. Rest now. The prayer has already been carried. Good night.